Hi everyone, and we are going to be learning today the Sicha in Parshas Behar, the first Sicha in Parshas Behar, and look at the Sichas in Chelek Yud Zayin. So the Sicha is a Rashi Sicha, and somewhat of a involved and complicated Rashi Sicha. We'll try to simplify it to the extent possible. But before we go to the Rashi, I want to learn a little piece of Gemara, which is, you might want to say, the basis of the Sicha. The Sicha is going to revolve very much around this Gemara, which, B'Hashgacha Pratis, is a Gemara from today's Daf in Masechta Saita. And by Lubavitch, there's a minig that during Sfir So'imer, we learn every single day one blot of Masechta Saita. Masechta Saita has 49 blot. Today, the day that we're recording this, is Tuesday, which is the 37th day of So'imer. And the Gemara, the Chazal on which this Rashi or the Sicha is going to be based is actually in today's Gemara in Saita Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. The Gemara says as follows: the Tanya, we learned Rabbi Shmuel, that Rabbi Shmuel says, "Klolos nemru b'Sinai upratus ba'Oil Moed." The Torah was given over in a general way at Har Sinai, and the pratim, the details, were given over to Moshe in the Oil Moed, in the Mishkan. Rabbi Kiva says, Klalus upratus nemru b'Sinai, that on Har Sinai already Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah and the mitzvahs both in a general way and also the details. And v'nishnu ba'Oil Moed, then these were repeated to Moshe Rabbeinu. Hashem repeated them to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Mishkan. V'nishtalshu ba'arvis Moav, and the third time they were said to Moshe Rabbeinu on the plains of Moav, which is in the 40th year. So let's explain what this means. So first of all, we have here Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shmuel. Both of them lived during the times of the Churban of the second Beis HaMikdash, a little before, a little after. And they're what we call Bari Plukta. They're, if you look in the Chazal, in the Mishnayos, and the Brises, they're very often arguing with each other over different matters. And over here the question is as follows. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu, the day after Shavuos, he goes up on Har Sinai and he spends 40 days over there. So the Torah was given on the 6th day of Sivan. On the 7th day of Sivan, Moshe Rabbeinu goes up, and for 40 days he's there learning the Torah. And then Moshe Rabbeinu comes down. Immediately when he comes down, there's the disaster of the Chet HaEgel, which has to be addressed right away. And then after that, there is the Mishkan. The Mishkan is built, and the Mishkan is inaugurated on Rosh Chodesh Nisan of the following year. Once the Mishkan is inaugurated, so then we have very clearly that Hashem, when he spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, he spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu only from when Moshe Rabbeinu was in the Mishkan. There was any more Har Sinai. This is something which we have clearly in Rashi in Parshas Kisisa, where Rashi talks about the process, and when Rashi says, "Umishahukam," from when the Mishkan was erected, "Leinedabri ime oid ela ma'oil moed." Hashem spoke to Moshe only from the Oil Moed. So there was Hashem teaching Moshe Torah in the 40 days on the desert, on the mountain, on Har Sinai. Then there was what Hashem taught Moshe Rabbeinu in the Oil Moed. In fact, the whole Chumash Vayikra begins, Vayikra Hashem el Moshe. Hashem calls out to Moshe, Vayidaber elav ma'oil moed leimer, and Hashem spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu from the Oil Moed, and that's when he told him all the halachas in Vayikra. And then there's a third time when Torah is repeated, which is in the 40th year, when the Yidden were in the desert, right before the Yidden are about to go into Eretz Yisrael, and Moshe Rabbeinu gathers the Yidden on Rosh Chodesh Shvat. This is a few weeks before he passes away, and he repeats much of the Torah, and that's what the Chumash Devarim that we have today. So Rabbi Shmuel says that in the 40 days when Moshe Rabbeinu was on Har Sinai, Hashem did not tell him all the details. He told him the klolos, he told him the general ideas of the Torah, but many of the details he did not say. So for example, Rashi gives an example over here in the Gemara. He says that on Har Sinai, Hashem tells Moshe, "V'zavachta alav v's'eleisecha v'shlomecha," that on the Mizbeach, that's where you should bring the carbon oila and the carbon shlomim. But Hashem didn't tell Moshe Rabbeinu how he's supposed to sprinkle the blood of the Mizbeach, which of the parts of the animal you're supposed to be makter on the Mizbeach. He didn't tell him the halachas of how you're supposed to take off the hide off the animal and cut it up, etc., etc. And that was given over to Moshe Rabbeinu from the Oil Moed. So in 40 days, Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu all the general ideas of Torah. The details were to follow in the Oil Moed. And then once again, these were repeated 40 years later Well, Moshe Rabbeinu, the Mishnah Torah, when he repeated the Torah to Klal Yisrael. That is the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva says no. Rabbi Akiva says that on Har Sinai in the 40 days, Hashem told Moshe, Klolus upratus, all the general concepts of all the mitzvahs and also the details were also given in the Har Sinai, which is, by the way, is pretty amazing. Okay, obviously we're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu. But nevertheless, the idea that in 40 days Hashem was able to give to Moshe Rabbeinu all the klolos and the pratis, all the general ideas and the details of all the mitzvahs, but that's what Rabbi Akiva holds. And then these were repeated to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Oyel Moed, in the Mishkan, and then a third time Moshe Rabbeinu repeated it to Klal Yisrael in Arvis Moav, on the plains of Moav, in the 40th year when the Yidden were in the desert. That is the machlekes in the Gemara over here. And now we're going to put this Gemara aside, and now we're going to learn the Sicha. But with this behind us, the Gemara will have a better understanding of the Sicha. The Sicha is based on a Rashi in the beginning of our Parsha. Our Parsha's Behar, begins with the words Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe. Hashem speaks to Moshe, Behar Sinai, on Har Sinai. And the Torah proceeds to talk about all the halachas of Shemitah. So Rashi, he cites the words of the pasuk Behar Sinai, and Rashi says, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai. What's the connection between Shemitah and Har Sinai? Some of you might be aware that this has become like a catchphrase amongst Frum Yidden. Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai. When you have two things that are seemingly totally disconnected from each other and someone randomly connects them, it's like the Jewish way of saying, what does it have to do with the price of rice in China? You say, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai. What's the connection? In other words, we have many, many different mitzvahs in the Torah, and we don't say by every single one of them that Hashem said about Har Sinai. Suddenly we have over here, we have that when the Torah introduces us to the mitzvah of Shemitah, it says by Har Sinai. Why? What's the connection? So Rashi says, V'aloi kol ha-mitzvahs nemar miSinai, and after all the mitzvahs were given by Har Sinai. Ella. So why in particular are we saying over here by this mitzvah of Har Sinai? So Rashi says, Ella ma Shemitah nemru. Just as when it comes to the mitzvah of Shemitah, so the general concept of Shemitah, as well as all the details and the particulars were given at Sinai, Afkul, and the same thing is all the mitzvahs, Nemru, Klalusehen, Viduktukehan, Misinai, all of the details were also given by Sinai. So Rashi is saying over here, the reason why that the Torah says over here, Behar Sinai, is not to teach us something necessarily about the mitzvah of Shemitah, but actually the Torah puts in the words over here of Behar Sinai to teach us something about the entire Torah. That all of the Torah, everything, all of the details, the general ideas and the details were given by Har Sinai. Now this is what Rashi is quoting actually from a medrash called the Torah's Kohanim. And now Rashi is going to explain this, because we still don't really fully understand what's going on over here. Number one, the question of Ma'i and Shemitah Eitzel Har Sinai still wasn't answered. Why was Shemitah chosen to be the mitzvah where the Torah informs us that by all mitzvahs were given to us with the details, and also the general ideas and the details were given by Har Sinai. Why Shemitah? That's question number one. But also, the logic we need to understand over here. Because by Shemitah it says Behar Sinai, that means that by every single mitzvah also the same applies? Maybe not. Maybe the Torah is telling us by Shemitah that it was Behar Sinai because Shemitah was given in Har Sinai. How do we know that this also applies to the rest of the Torah? So Rashi explains. Rashi explains that I believe V'nira li shekach pirusha. I believe that this is the meaning of the Medrash. Lefi sheloi motzinu shmitas karkois. We do not find that the mitzvah of Shemitah, shenishnis ba'arvis moya b'mishnah Torah. We don't find the concept of Shemitah mentioned in Chumash Devarim. So 40 years later, Moshe is giving over the entire Torah. There's no mention of Shemitah. Which, although the Rebbe doesn't say this, is kind of peculiar, especially since Shemitah only began when the Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael. The Yidden are on the cusp, about to enter Eretz Yisrael. You'd think that Moshe Rabbeinu would want to encourage them and urge them and remind them about the mitzvah, but it's not mentioned there. So Lamadnu, what does that tell us? What can we infer from that? The fact that it's not mentioned in Devarim, as opposed to other mitzvahs that are mentioned in Devarim, with many of their details mentioned in Devarim, That tells us that in this particular mitzvah, Shemitah, it must be that all of it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu Behar Sinai, which is why it's not mentioned in the Devarim. And therefore the pasuk comes and learns over here, I'll call dibur of the dibur shenidbar, I'll call dibur shenidbar l'moshe shemesinai hayu kulam klalusein of diktutein. From here we know that every single one of the mitzvahs that was given to Moshe, that all of the details and the particulars and the general ideas, all of them were given by Sinai, v'chazru v'nishnu ba'arvis Moav, and then once again they were repeated in Moav. So Rashi is saying something very interesting over here. He's saying Shemitah is unique, and this is going to answer both the questions we just asked. Shemitah is unique that it happens to be the one mitzvah where it's completely 100% unnecessary to say Behar Sinai. Why? Because since it wasn't repeated ba'arvis Moav, obviously it was Behar Sinai. So why is the Torah choosing the one mitzvah where it's obvious that it was given Behar Sinai? Why is it choosing that one mitzvah to tell us Behar Sinai? So obviously it's teaching us that just like Shemitah was given by Har Sinai, and I'm telling you it was given by Har Sinai, even though I don't need to tell it to you over here, the same thing applies by every other mitzvah in the Torah. To put it in somewhat different words. Had the Torah said Behar Sinai by a different mitzvah, you would say, oh, that mitzvah was given by Har Sinai. That's what the Torah is trying to tell us. By Shemitah, you can say that the Torah is trying to teach you something about Shemitah, because Shemitah we already know. So it must be teaching us about the entire Torah. That is the Rashi, which includes again the Torah's Kohanim, and also the Rashi's interpretation of the Torah's Kohanim. Now, what is this Rashi trying to tell us over here? So we know there are many different Mefarshim on Rashi, and there's the consensus seems to be amongst the Mefarshim of Rashi that Rashi is understanding this pasuk and understanding this Torah's Kohanim to be a proof to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, which we spoke about in the Gemara. Remember, we had this argument between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. And Rabbi Akiva says that everything was included, everything was given to Moshe, both the details and the general mitzvah was given in on Har Sinai. Rabbi Shmuel disagrees. He says, no, only the general concepts were given at Har Sinai, the details were given later. So the Mefarshim understand this Rashi as siding with Rabbi Akiva. Now, obviously, Rashi is not siding with Rabbi Akiva versus Rabbi Shmuel. Rashi is Rishon, and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel were Tanoim. But Rashi, the interpretation of Torah's Kohanim, follows the opinion of, and therefore the Rashi's interpretation of the pasuk follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, not of Rabbi Shmuel. The Rebbe doesn't accept this. The Rebbe doesn't accept that Rashi over here is adopting the position of Rabbi Akiva as opposed to Rabbi Shmuel. And for several reasons, and again, because the Sicha is a very complicated Sicha, we are not going to be giving over every question and every reason the Rebbe gives. We're going to be focusing more on the Klal Seha as opposed to the Diktukim and as opposed to the different details of the Sicha. The Rebbe says that in Pshutei Shel Mikra, we know Rashi is always following Pshutei Shel Mikra, which means Rashi looks at the Pasuk and the Chumash and understands it in the simplest way possible. A simple reading of the Torah is that Moshe received the general ideas on Har Sinai and the particulars later on. Because that's the way the Torah is structured. That first Moshe Rabbeinu goes up on the mountain and he receives the Torah. And then afterwards we have all the details being introduced. And in Pshutei Shel Mikra, there is no indication anywhere that all these mitzvahs that we're learning about now in Chumash Vayikra is being repeated a second time. Moreover, there are certain times we find in the Midbar that Moshe Rabbeinu encountered certain questions. One example of this is the Mekoisha Sheitzim, the person who was gathering wood on Shabbos. And Moshe didn't know what to do. He turns to Hashem, what do we do with this guy? And another example we had in last week's Parsha about the person who cursed Hashem. Again, Moshe didn't know what to do. So the simple reading of the Chumash, Pshutei Shel Mikra, is that Moshe did not receive all the details of all the mitzvahs in Har Sinai, because otherwise he would have known what to do. So therefore, to say that Rashi over here in Pshutei Shel Mikra is siding with Rabbi Akiva is difficult. In Pshutei Shel Mikra, Rabbi Shmuel is the more logical way of looking at things, which is that Moshe received the general ideas on Har Sinai, and only later did he receive the details. That's number one. But there's something else also. If we look in the wording of Rashi, what does Rashi say over here? Rashi says, going back, he says, we don't find that Shemitah is mentioned in Devarim. So therefore we know that everything was mentioned by Sinai. 1 second. Devarim? How does that even enter the equation over here? The machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel was only whether everything was originally said on Har Sinai, or whether it was also, or whether it was first revealed in the Oil Moed. But both of them agree that everything was already said before Arvis Moev, before Devarim. So even if Shemitah is not mentioned in Devarim, that doesn't tell us that it wasn't said in the Oil Moed. That doesn't tell us that at all. So the wording of Rashi over here is not going according to Rabbi Akiva. If Rashi would have said that this teaches us that everything was said in Har Sinai and not in the Oil Moed, that would be Rabbi Akiva. But Rashi doesn't say that. So therefore, the Rebbe doesn't accept that Rashi over here is in Pshut Yishal Mikra is siding with Rabbi Akiva. Instead, the Rebbe says that actually what's bothering Rashi over here is something else entirely, which this is something which is, we find this many times, that the Rebbe will say that Rashi, even when Rashi will bring a question, the question that Rashi brings is not the question that's really bothering him. The question and answer is really there, both of them, to answer another question which he has. And that's in this case over here. The question that Rashi has is on the words Behar Sinai, because that's the words from the pasuk that Rashi cites. The pasuk says, "Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe Behar Sinai." Hashem speaks to Moshe Behar Sinai. We're here holding in Parshas Behar. Already in Parshas Kisisa, we already found out, as you mentioned earlier, that Hashem stopped talking to Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai. In the beginning of Vayikra, which was many parshas ago, Hashem already starts talking to Moshe exclusively from the Oil Moed. So what does it mean that this mitzvah was said by Har Sinai? That's the problem that Rashi is trying to address. How are we going to resolve this question? So Mefarshim actually do talk about this. The Rambam talks about it, the Ibn Ezra talks about it. Two possible answers are given. One answer is, the Ibn Ezra says, Ein muktam u'mu'uchar b'Torah. There's this rule that in Torah not everything is in order. So even though already a few parshas ago we have Parshas Vayikra where Hashem starts talking to Moshe from the Oil Moed, yeah, but this happened earlier. The Rebbe has difficulty with this. In Pshut Yishal Mikra, yes, Ein muktam u'mu'uchar b'Torah. It's true that not everything in the Torah is in chronological order, but there has to be a compelling reason why something should be out of order, and we don't find any compelling reason here that would explain and justify why we have something this much out of order. Another possible answer the Ramban gives, he says, yes, Hashem told this to Moshe, the mitzvah Shemitah, on Har Sinai, but Moshe only told it to Klal Yisrael now at this point in time. So first of all, it's difficult to accept. Why would Moshe delay giving it over to the Yidden for that amount of time? And moreover, the pasuk here begins with the words, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe b'Har Sinai, and the implication is that at this point in time, Hashem addresses Moshe from Har Sinai. Why is he addressing Moshe from Har Sinai? Again, all these months already after Hashem stopped speaking to Moshe in Har Sinai and rather spoke to him only in the Mishkan. And therefore, Rashi understands that the words Behar Sinai don't mean on top of Har Sinai, but alongside Har Sinai. What was alongside Har Sinai? Was the Oil Moed. So Rashi understands Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Behar Sinai as meaning Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Oil Moed, which was in Midbar Sinai and alongside Har Sinai. But that's a little, you might want to say this is a doichik, to say that. How can you interpret Behar Sinai as meaning the Oil Moed? So the whole Torah's Kohanim that Rashi is bringing, as well as his interpretation of the Torah's Kohanim, is only, Rashi is bringing it down to support his contention. By the way, the unsaid contention, this is, you have to learn Rashi well to understand what he's really trying to say. The idea that Behar Sinai can mean also Bimidbar Sinai, alongside the Har Sinai. And how is that? The Torah's Kohanim is relying on the fact that Behar Sinai means Bimidbar Sinai. Think about it for a moment. What does the Torah's Kohanim say? That Torah's Kohanim is saying that the reason why it says Behar Sinai by Shemitah is because it wasn't repeated by Arvis Moev. It wasn't repeated by Arvis Moev, so that's a sign that it was said by Har Sinai. 1 second, if it wasn't repeated by Arvis Moev, that's not a sign that it was said by Har Sinai. Maybe it means it was said in the Oil Moed. How does the Torah's Kohanim say that because it wasn't repeated by on Arvis Moav, that means that was Behar Sinai. So obviously the Torah's Kohanim is understanding the words Behar Sinai as meaning Bemidbar Sinai. So therefore, if we understand Behar Sinai as meaning both on the mountain as well as alongside the mountain Oyel Moed, the fact that Shemitah was not repeated by Arvis Moav is a proof that it must have been said Behar Sinai. And that's why Rashi brings down the Torah's Kohanim, not because Rashi is bothered by the connection between Shemitah and Har Sinai. It's because Rashi is bothered, again, why does it say over here Behar Sinai when Hashem stopped talking to Moshe and Har Sinai? Hashem is talking to Moshe from the Oyel Moed. Rashi wants to understand that Behar Sinai here means not on the mountain, but rather alongside the mountain in the Oyel Moed. And his proof for the fact that Behar Sinai can also mean alongside the mountain, the Oyel Moed, is from the Torah's Kohanim. That is the technical aspect of the Sicha. And then the Rebbe moves on to a fascinating explanation according to Chassidus based on this idea which we talked about over here. We have here a machlokes here between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says the whole Torah, the details and the general principles were given, both the general principles and the details were given on Har Sinai. Rabbi Yishmael disagrees. So, on a very practical level, what really happened? Who's right? Is Rabbi Akiva right? Is Rabbi Yishmael right? And by the way, why does Rabbi Akiva say this and why does Rabbi Yishmael say that? From the Rebbe's perspective, the way the Rebbe explains everything always, you have the idea of Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. They're both right. Now, what actually happened? I don't know. Maybe this happened, maybe that happened. Maybe it was a combination of both. But they're both right because they're both telling us larger spiritual ideas. And we have to explore what is Rabbi Akiva really telling us on the spiritual level? What is Rabbi Yishmael really telling us? And then there's another general teaching of the Rebbe is that when you have a person saying something, Rabbi Akiva saying something, it's his opinion is a reflection of himself and his unique Avodas Hashem. Rabbi Yishmael's opinion is a reflection of himself and his unique personality and his unique Avodas Hashem. So if we want to understand what Rabbi Akiva is saying or Rabbi Yishmael is saying, let's first take a look at Rabbi Akiva, let's take a look at Rabbi Yishmael, who they were, what they stood for, and then we'll understand their opinions and we'll also understand the relevance to us and how both of these opinions are correct, but what they mean to us in real time and in real life. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, as mentioned earlier in the class, were what we call bar pluktas, meaning that they very frequently disagreed with each other, which is not very surprising, because it's hard to find two people with more different backgrounds and life stories than Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael was a Kohen, and according to some opinions, he was a Kohen Gadol. What does that mean according to some opinions? We know there's Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha Kohen Gadol. There's a question whether the Rabbi Yishmael, who's the bar plukta of Rabbi Akiva, the Rabbi Yishmael who was always the one who having a machlokes with Rabbi Akiva, was the same Rabbi Yishmael or not. But he was definitely a Kohen. We know Rabbi Yishmael was a Kohen. Is he the same individual as Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha Kohen Gadol? We don't know. Definitely a Kohen, maybe even a Kohen Gadol. So we're talking about a person who comes from the holiest stock possible, a Kohen. Regarding Kehanim, it says, Vayibodel Aaron, the Aaron was separated, and he is Kodesh Kadoshim, the holiest of the holy. And he was a tzaddik his entire life. And then we have Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was not a descendant of Aaron HaKohen. Rabbi Akiva wasn't even a descendant of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Rabbi Akiva was a Ben Gerim. Rabbi Akiva was a descendant of Gerim. So talk about the sum opposite. And then Rabbi Akiva, not only was he a descendant of Gerim, but Rabbi Akiva himself was a Baal Tshuva, as the story of Rabbi Akiva is well known. So when you have two such different personalities as Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, one of whom is from the holiest stock possible, a Kohen, and a tzaddik, the other one is a Ben Gerim and a Baal Tshuva, is it surprising that they see everything differently? Not really. What is the primary area of difference between a tzaddik like Rabbi Yishmael and a Baal Tshuva like Rabbi Akiva? So the Rebbe says, the primary difference between the avodah of a tzaddik and a Baal Tshuva is the area of Mesiras Nefesh. We know that Rabbi Akiva excelled in the area of Mesiras Nefesh to the point that, we know Rabbi Akiva was one of the Asara Harugi Malchus. He's one of the 10 martyrs. Rabbi Yishmael might have been, depending on whether he's identified with Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. Then maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But Rabbi Akiva, we know, was killed al kiddush Hashem. And as he's being killed and he's being tortured to death in a most painful way, his students were present, and the students turned to, and they see that Rabbi Akiva is smiling, and the students turn to Rabbi Akiva and say, Rebbe, Atkan, like, really? You're smiling now? They're killing you in the most painful, gruesome death possible. You're smiling? And Rabbi Akiva says, Kol Yamai, my entire life, all of my days, Nitzta'arti, I was pained by the fact that I have not yet been Zoicha to be able to give up my life for Hashem. I'm living my entire life with a desire to give up my life al Kiddush Hashem, to have Mesiras Nefesh. And now that I have this opportunity, I shouldn't smile. This is what I'm waiting for my entire life. Rabbi Akiva was the idea of Mesiras Nefesh. And why is that? Because that is one of the big differences between a tzaddik and a Baal Tshuva. A tzaddik is put here in this world, and a tzaddik is very comfortable in this world. Why is that? Because a tzaddik knows that he or she has a mission to learn Torah and to do mitzvahs and to make the world into dir betachtoinen. And the tzaddik works within the parameters of the world. The tzaddik is here to build up the world and to make the world into a holy place. The Baal Tshuva is very different. The Baal Tshuva has experienced the world in the most negative way, has experienced the darkness of the world. And the Baal Tshuva is disgusted with the world, is sick of the world. The Baal Tshuva only wants Hashem. The Baal Tshuva's avodah is in a way of Mesiras Nefesh. The Baal Tshuva is looking always just to connect to Hashem. What's we call an avodah l'mayla medida v'agbala, beyond the structure of the world and beyond the way the world runs. All the Baal Tshuva wants is Mesiras Nefesh. That's a product of where they came from. Now, Mesiras Nefesh is also important to tzaddik. The Alter Rebbe talks about it in Peir Chafei in Tanya, that even someone who's a tzaddik, the ability to be able to do Torah and mitzvahs property is predicated on the person every once in a while contemplating the idea that I'd be willing to give up my life al Kiddush Hashem, which is why every morning we say Shema, and when we say Shema, we think about that we'd give up our life al Kiddush Hashem, and that gives us the koyach for the day. So for the tzaddik, Mesiras Nefesh plays a role once in the beginning of the day, and that is the engine that drives the rest of the day. But the rest of the day, the tzaddik is not living in a tenuah of, I need to get out of this world, I need to connect to Hashem. No, the tzaddik is within the world, perfecting the world, making the world a holy place. Whereas the Baal Tshuva is constantly seeking just to connect to Hashem. So that was Rabbi Akiva versus Rabbi Yishmael. This idea of the avodah of the tzaddik versus the avodah of the Baal Tshuva is the difference between Har Sinai, between Har Sinai and Midbar Sinai and the Oil Moed. The Oil Moed was a very structured place. The Ramah tells us that the positioning of the different objects within the Oil Moed, within the Mishkan, and the way the Oil Moed was set up was a reflection of the entire creation, a reflection of what we call the entire Seder Hishtalshalos. That's the avodah of the tzaddik. Everything is structured, and this mitzvah, and that mitzvah, and the other mitzvah working within the world, perfecting the world. Midbar represents a Baal Tshuva. Alter Rebbe explains on Kuti Torah that Midbar represents a Baal Tshuva from both ways, both from where the Baal Tshuva came from and where the Baal Tshuva ends up. The Baal Tshuva comes from a Midbar, that makes sense, comes from a desert, a desolate place, a place where things don't grow, etc. As opposed to a tzaddik is associated more with a populated city or a field where things grow. But a Midbar also represents the Baal Tshuva because of the destination of the Baal Tshuva. The pasuk says about a Midbar, about a desert, Asher lo yoshav Adam sham. It's a place where a Adam does not reside. What is a Adam? A Adam is the perfect person. We know that there are different names for the human being. Adam, Ish, Enosh, Gever. Adam represents the perfect person. A Midbar is a place where the perfect person, the tzaddik, does not reside. And that's reflective of what the Gemara says, that b'makim shebali tshuva eimdem in tzaddikim gemurim yecholim lamid. The level of a Baal Tshuva, where the Baal Tshuva is, the tzaddik isn't there. Lo yoshav Adam sham, because the Baal Tshuva is higher than the tzaddik. So that's why the place of the Baal Tshuva is the Midbar, because lo yoshav Adam sham, there is no tzaddikim over there. So the Oil Moed represents the avodah of a tzaddik. A Midbar represents the avodah of Baal Tshuva, which is the avodah of Mesiras Nefesh. And now we understand the opinions of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Shmuel is a tzaddik, and he says, yes, the general idea of all the mitzvahs came from the Midbar, which is the idea that even a tzaddik, the foundation of his or her avodas Hashem is Mesiras Nefesh, the Shema Yisrael they say in the morning. But ultimately, throughout the day, that's in the Oyel Moed. The details of everything is in a structured way, the way a tzaddik approaches things. Rabbi Akiva says, no, my friend, I'm sorry. Maybe that works for you as a tzaddik. I'm a Baal Tshuva, and I'm telling you, everything was given in Har Sinai. Everything was given in the Midbar. The details also have to be infused with Mesiras Nefesh. Every single part of every single mitzvah is from Midbar Sinai. That means that a person who walks around the Kol Yamai and his entire life is with this incredible longing for Hashem, this incredible Mesiras Nefesh, and this incredible desire to connect to Hashem, and a complete disillusionment, you might want to say, with Olam Hazeh. Interesting how that little machlokes, the chronological sequencing of how it happened between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel is reflective of the larger avodas Hashem and life journeys. The Rebbe says as follows. Rashi, as we mentioned, Rashi learns like Rabbi Shmuel. In Pshutei Shel Mikra, Rabbi Shmuel is the more logical one, which is that the general ideas were given in Har Sinai and the details were given later. But what is the halacha? Now, this isn't really a question for halacha. You won't find it in Shulchan Aruch. But however, there is a rule that whenever there's an argument between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel, we follow Rabbi Akiva. The halacha is according to Rabbi Akiva, which, by the way, is fascinating in and of itself. Now that we understand Rabbi Shmuel was the Kohen Gadol and the Tzaddik, the Kohen Gadol, the Tzaddik. Rabbi Akiva was the Ben Gerim and the Baal Tshuva, and the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, which itself is very interesting. But maybe we'll have a little insight into why that is. So Rashi again sides with their sides, learns Pshutei Shel Mikra like Rabbi Shmuel, halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. Why is that? Rashi is explaining the Chumash, the Torah. From the Torah's perspective, the Torah actually endorses Rabbi Shmuel. The Torah doesn't want you to be a Baal Tshuva. The Torah wants you to be a tzaddik. So therefore, Pshutei Shel Mikra follows Rabbi Shmuel, because from the Torah's perspective, Hashem puts you down here in the world. He wants you to be a tzaddik. He wants you to work within the world and refining the world, making the world holy, etc. But that's not the halacha. Practically speaking, halacha, and especially in Galus, we're Bali Tshuva. Practically speaking, the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva. And practically speaking, although that might not have been the original intention of the Torah, we are Bali Tshuva. We follow the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, which is that every moment of our day should be infused with this unlimited and untrammeled love for Hashem, this Mesiras Nefesh, which has to infuse every single moment of our day, every one of our mitzvahs, and every time that we learn Torah.